The anticipated effect of our federal government's fiscal and regulatory policy on domestic and FDI M&A in the year ahead has been very much top of mind for us at the M&A Advisor and in the offices of one of the most prolific middle market M&A investment banking firms, Generational Equity. And so with their encouragement, we've created a keynote conversation to open up the symposium today to explore this subject from the vantage point of a successful professional investor, John K. Castle, who brings 45 years of private equity experience to the dialogue, a former M&A attorney who became an influential government insider and has now transitioned to private practice, counseling and guiding international financial investors, Nicole M. Hale, and the insightful business editor for one of the world's most important financial media, Dennis Perman. Please join me in welcoming them for what I'm sure will be a most enlightening conversation.
Let's get right to it. When I see business people, largely CEOs, see a lot of them, most of them express disappointment in the Obama administration and the way it's approached business. They view it as out of touch with what businesses need and ergo with the gears of the economy that make things better for people in this country overall. What was your experience, and would you say that there's some merit to that? There's not? Like, what specific things can you tell us to say that is or it's not the case?
Well, during my time in the administration, I have to say, it's one of the challenges I think that we had was communicating what we were doing and communicating it in a way that really resonated. I find it to be frustrating sometimes to hear that message when you consider that the automotive industry, which is thriving now, General Motors, I hear, is doing pretty well lately, was supported by the Obama administration, as was Chrysler, and things are on the uptick. I think that was positive. I think that some of the interventions in the financial industry were positive. So I think that there is a disconnect there that largely is due to lack of communication. As I talk about the trade agenda, I mean, the trade agenda is all about helping businesses, and we talk about trade agreements as being free trade agreements. Someone said the other day that it's really rule of law agreements, that in these emerging markets that you're going in, to the extent that the U.S. and the U.S. government is really the only player that can play in that space in terms of these trade agreements, to the extent that we can, through these agreements, raise first of all, level the playing field, and then focus on the rule of law. That only helps you in your global transactions.
John, you agree with the Obama administration?
Well, Dennis, I think the
feeling
that I have is that the administration is viewed as not very business friendly. Now, even in the takeover of General Motors and Chrysler, they were very union friendly, but as far as business friendly, not necessarily so. And of course, if you were a bondholder in those things, they were just downright abusive. But most business people, I think, look at a whole bunch of things in terms of their relationship with Washington, and they find them to be negative. The antitrust rules are being enforced reasonably aggressively. The environmental laws are very troublesome, and some obvious things such as the pipeline to Canada can't even get done, even though it's would be highly desirable for our economy. Obamacare is a huge problem for many, many businesses. Over the years, I've owned many, many restaurant companies and so forth. When you're buying a restaurant company today, the first question is, how is Obamacare going to affect that? And of course, actually, in many cases, it's not going to affect it too much because everybody's only employing people for 29 hours. They've established policies that they just don't hire full-time employees. In other cases, when asked the question, are they going to pay the penalty or are they going to give the health insurance? And I think many companies are going to pay the penalty. $2,000 here in New York, a married person insurance, if they have a family, this is $30,000 a year. Well, for $2,000 a penalty versus $30,000, you might make a decision to discontinue insurance. There's all this discussion about minimum wage now, possibly taking it to $15 from wherever it is in certain states.
15 seems a little extreme, but the real minimum wage, its real purchasing power over time, has certainly declined over the last 20 years.
Businesses are very sophisticated today, and I know Nicole took a lot of people internationally travel, but many businesses, medium-sized businesses, I'm talking about businesses of a few $100 million, or even a few tens of millions of dollars, and can quickly transfer manufacturing to, say, China or someplace in Asia. Well, they are coming back to the degree that China has had, I have plants in China, the wage rates have probably doubled in the last 8 years. So right now they're coming back. But if you move the minimum wage to $15, we're going to be back in China because that's a huge gap. And to the degree that the United States has had a slight benefit or has had an improving set of terms of trade, they disappear as soon as you go to $15 minimum wages and things like that.
So as we focus this on people who are doing deals, trying to put companies together, John, the Washington Factor right now, what's the most important thing you look for when you're buying or selling a business as it relates to Washington?
I think Washington is generally a negative. Now, there's one thing that is a positive, which may ultimately prove to be a negative, and that is that, of course, with the quantitative easing, we've had very low relative interest rates, availability of money, not from banks, because the regulatory process has resulted in most commercial banks not loaning money to mid-sized companies. We're talking about up to $500 million. But you can get the money through hedge funds and through GE Credit and other organizations. But fundamentally, these low interest rates have meant that people were able to borrow money on very favorable interest rates terms. Now, I say it may result in a headache later because as you have the reduction of that buying that's going on now, interest rates are going to go up.
So why don't we see more deals? Right? If the Fed is pushing the world, frankly, into equities right now, why aren't people who are putting companies together?
Well, in many cases, I think people look beyond this artificial quantitative easing and they say, well, the purchase prices that folks think they should be getting are quite high at this point.
All right, Nicole, what's your view? I know it's hard for any of us to really predict the Fed or opine on the future of monetary and fiscal collisions, but your view on how the Fed and monetary policy overall around the globe is affecting the businesses you deal with?
Well, certainly, to the extent that the government intervenes, I mean, it really depends on, the circumstance, right? I mean, certainly quantitative easing has been a significant advantage for us. I worry about it because it's addictive, At some point, it can't sustain itself, and we will come back to some semblance of reality, and we have to be able to deal within that reality. But I think that generally speaking, it's a net positive. I don't like to see the government intervening in markets, but given the crisis that we had, I think it was necessary, and I think that what we're seeing, and it's sluggish, but what we're seeing in terms of the improvement in the economy, the reduction of the unemployment rate, I think it, net is positive.
All right, so John, it does seem, you brought up a good point, right? The artificiality of the economy. I look at the stock market, it's trading at 16 times forward earnings. And yet, if you look at the actual earnings power and earnings growth of companies in the S&P 500, for instance, you don't really see any of true organic appreciation in a lot of the stock buybacks. Is the real economy, let's say we take away the Fed, the true Washington effect from this equation, is the real economy of the companies you deal with really solid enough to go without those trading?
I think people today are very concerned that it isn't solid enough. I mentioned restaurants. Restaurants are frequently a very good coincident indicator of the economy. If restaurants' comp sales are up, if you have a good business week, you have nice sales, you get a nice check from because of your commission basis. You go out and we'll have a great dinner. weekend. If you have a really rotten week, you have macaroni and cheese at home. Therefore, restaurants are frequently a very good coincident indicator, and they are not very strong right now. They are very, as a matter of fact, in many cases, they seem to be making it. It sounds like the whole series of sales and retail and so forth around Black Friday and so forth
We're not
generally very good either.
So you're saying the market right now is expecting the Fed to pull out beginning of 2014. All indications seem to be that that's where it's headed.
You're saying that, but
no, who knows, right? But let's just say let's establish that as the base case. Training wheels come off. We're this kid going down the sidewalk, and boom, we fall over and scrape our knee collectively as a country. That's your prediction, Nicole.
Well, I think that does not have to be the outcome. I think that it's important that we continue to. I think the policies and the certainty, if we can create some certainty in Washington in terms of the policy environment, the regulatory environment, I think that businesses will continue to invest in the country. This country is still the best country in the world to invest. I don't think anybody in this room would disagree with me on that. In 2011, there's a number, I think it was $225 billion of investment occurred from companies headquartered offshore into the U.S. So they're seeing something here, and I think that it's positive. So I think that we certainly have an opportunity as confidence improves in the economy, and as some of that money that's on the balance sheets that hasn't been moved off and into investment occurs, that once the training wheels come off, we may not be ready for the Tour de France, but I think that we'll be better.
I'm a loyal American and wish you were totally correct, but I think that the reality is that businessmen are very sophisticated these days. For instance, if you can get lower tax rates elsewhere, why not incorporate your company elsewhere?
Unless your IP is going to be stolen, John.
Well, it may be stolen. It may be stolen either way, but you have a number of companies in the oil services industry that have reincorporated in Switzerland, have moved their headquarters to Dubai, things of that particular nature. We have a company now that happens to be organized in Grand Cayman, so we don't pay any U.S. income taxes. So you don't have to, unless you have operations in the United States, you aren't paying U.S. income taxes. When it comes to securities markets, because of Sarbanes-Oxley and all of that stuff, we had companies that were contemplating public offerings in the UK. Years ago, would have been New York for sure. Now, looks like the UK.
But what about the Jobs Act? The Jobs Act was supposed to, I love the acronym. In my mind, they're rolling back decades of securities regulation and investor safeguards. But nonetheless, for smaller companies, this should be a revelation.
The smallest companies, of course, probably aren't in a position to go to the UK to go public.
Right.
But the Jobs Act doesn't help very much. You have all of these other regulations, Sarbanes-Oxley, and of course, Mr. Terrible one is Dodd-Frank, particularly related to the private equity industry. I say it's as relevant for the private equity industry as the Federal Aviation Administration would be for horseback riding.
And what's the problem with Dodd-Frank and private equity?
Well, as I said, it's as relevant as the Federal Aviation industry. Just let me finish. The logic is that if you have a horse, you fly a little bit, and therefore, if you put them under the FAA, you'd have to have altimeters, and you have to have two-way radios, and you have to file a flight plan, and you have to do all these things. In the case of private equity, under Dodd-Frank, you're doing all of these things that are relevant if you're trading maybe in public securities markets, but you're not trading in public securities markets, and it's just piles and piles of regulation that have virtually nothing to do with it.
Is there one regulation you have to deal with in your current capacity, John, that you would point out to this?
Dodd-Frank, just rip it out.
Well, that's a big one.
Well, tens of thousands of regulations. It's keeping track of everybody's stock accounts
Right.
when we're dealing in private companies. Companies you cannot buy in the public market.
Nicole, what do you see out there? He brings up Dodd-Frank. The clients you're dealing with, perhaps foreign companies that want to invest in the U.S. Does this come up? What's the outside perception of us, of the Washington effect from other people around the world?
Well, certainly I think that people were concerned about the shutdown, some of the gridlock that we've experienced. But again, I think my experience has been that companies based overseas are very attracted to this market because of the talent that we have here, because of the rule of law, quite frankly. And I think that, I hear everything that John is saying, but I do believe that to the extent that we can create certainty, the businesses I talk to say, in some ways I don't care what the rule is as long as I know what the rule is. I don't care what it happens to be, I just want certainty. So I don't think that it's a deterrent at all to foreign investment in the US.
So what's a business person to do when that person, maybe she feels like she just doesn't have certainty on given rules or regulations, or there's some tendril of Dodd-Frank that touches her business? What's that business person to do in face of uncertainty? What's your counsel when you sit in front of them and they say, "Look, I don't know how this is going to change or not"? What do you say to them?
Well, certainly I would say that just as, and my focus is really emerging markets, but just as, I would say that the approach would be similar in the U.S. You have to know who your stakeholders are, and you have to have counsel on how to navigate some of these issues that we've talked about. I mean, there are ways to do it, and certainly it's something that through there's some opaqueness, but certainly in the U.S. there's more transparency than in other markets. And one of the things that I often point people to nowadays who are foreign investors into the U.S. is the Select USA program, which is a very novel program that the Obama administration established that acts a little bit like an ombudsman to help companies navigate regulatory challenges both on the federal level and the state level.
And these are only foreign direct investment or
Well,
domestic?
they also help companies who want to expand, who are already based in the U.S. and want to stay and expand in the U.S.
Okay.
So that's a benefit, I'd say, a positive of the Washington
Right.
effect.
And Nicole, we're really lucky to have you because you've spent time on a really important body inside Washington, Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, run by Treasury, convening agencies from around the government to vet foreign investments into the country for national security issues. I know you can't talk a lot about the details of
I
it,
have to kill you.
but you have to kill me. That might liven up things this morning. But what would you say to people who know a little bit about CFIUS and maybe encountered it a little bit in their professional lives? What's the one thing you can't tell them that they may not know, that they may not have understood about the process, about the people?
Sure.
Just take us a little bit inside as far as you can go.
Sure. Well, CFIUS, one myth is that CFIUS affects every foreign, foreign direct investment transaction that comes into the U.S. That is not the case. It does not affect greenfield investments. And it's certainly, I'd say, after John and I were talking about this, maybe less than 1% of such deals come before CFIUS. It's really about national security. It is an interagency group. I represented the Commerce Department on CFIUS for 4 years. And I was really the voice of the fact that economic security is also, an important ingredient to national security. So I tried to bring some balance to the analysis. It is, I can't talk a lot about it, obviously, because of my security clearance is still in place, but I would say that it's a process that, if navigated and taken into account early in a deal, can be managed very effectively. Often what we would see is that companies would use their hometown lawyer, perhaps, to try to structure it and not realize that CFIUS was in play, and it would have to get additional counsel to help them navigate that process. I think that if dealt with early, it can be managed.
So the advice is hire more lawyers.
Well, I could be, there are probably a few lawyers in the room that would be happy
Probably
to
are.
say
Probably
that.
happy to hear that.
Hire good lawyers.
Good
Okay.
lawyers who understand the process, because, it's gonna build in perhaps 75 additional days into your deal flow, depending on your deal timing, depending on what the issues are.
Okay, now John, we only have a few minutes left. I gotta ask you a question. You've had a great career, august firm, done lots of interesting things. If you were starting today, if you were Greenfields, Castle Harlow, what would your firm be like? Would it be even based in the United States?
Well, I, of course, think that New York is an interesting place to be based, and there probably would be a lot of things that are similar, but I do think that businessmen have become very sophisticated, and that you can base your company in a wide variety of places. And most companies today have some international aspect. Maybe they're buying product or bringing in product from China, or maybe they've exploited the U.S. market. They want to go to Europe or go to Asia or whatever. And in that process, you may conclude that being incorporated someplace else is a good idea. With respect to CFIUS, I don't think it affects most commercial transactions for most businesses. And in the last 45 years, the only real instance I've had where CFIUS was involved was we were making a computer that was used in seismic work with the oil industry, trying to make sure and I couldn't figure out why the Navy was so excited about this. It turned out that this particular computer could also be used to keep track of submarines. And so they went nuts, and we had a lot of long story, but CFIUS, I don't think is generally for probably most of the people in this room going to be an issue. But I believe you can raise the issue of if you're buying a multi-international company, why be in the United States? Why not be in some other country?
Okay, last questions here for you guys. Nicole, this panel's titled The Washington Effect. Does the budget deal really suggest that something's fundamentally changed inside Washington? And as you say, people can put aside things. You have your pulse in Washington. They can put aside their worries about problems of cooperation with government.
Well, if it gets done, maybe for 2 years.
For 2 years.
That's better than 6 months, right?
I might add just something on that specific subject. I think the Republican Party has probably learned better how to deal with the Tea Party aspect of the Republican Party. And it appears to me that they've made some basic decisions that they're going to work around the Tea Party, which will make them more cooperative. Of course, there's this lady from San Francisco who might be, we certainly don't want to see her in the equation. But net, I think the Republicans have concluded that being obstructionist is not a constructive thing, not a useful thing to do.
So Nicole got the first word. Let's give you the last word, John. Perhaps the ultimate test of whether you believe in America. Are you putting your money to work, and why?
In the United States,
yeah.
We put our money to work anywhere in the world.
But are you putting together on deals now?
We look at deals in the United States, but we have a company where all of its operations are in the Eastern Hemisphere and it's headquartered in Dubai.
Okay, well that's an uplifting sentiment.
So
The great American.
a high return on investment.
So are there investments, high return investments in the U.S.? I just got a question.
Of course there are, right?
There no doubt are. There are also extraordinarily high prices in the United States right now. So,
And we can thank the Fed for that?
probably.
Okay, we'll end it there.
Or maybe that will be the basis of putting an ice pack on our head in a few years when you don't have the alternative of selling it.
All right. Well, that may be good news for this group, which does a lot of restructuring. So, thank you to John and Nicole, two great guests joining me today.